Welcome to the Asia Society. We're delighted to have you here this evening for this thought-provoking conversation with Dr. Lee and his new book, The Sister, North Korea's Kim Yo Jong, The Most Dangerous Woman. As Sanjeev mentioned, my name is Emma Whitmyer, and I'm a program officer here at the Asia Society Policy Institute. Also, as Sanjeev mentioned, we have many exciting programs and events taking place here at the Asia Society this fall, such as Meiji Modern, as well as a discussion between Asia Society Policy Institute's Vice President Danny Russell and the U.S. Ambassador to Japan, Rahm Emanuel, on Friday, October 20th. We hope you'll come back to check out these programs. And if you're interested in more about arts, culture, education, and policy, please consider signing up for our newsletter. Now on to our guest this evening. He is a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and previously taught Korean history at Tufts University. He has written on politics of the Korean Peninsula for numerous publications, including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post. He has testified as an expert witness at the U.S. House of Representatives Foreign Affairs Committee hearings on North Korea policy and has advised senior leaders, including the President of the United States. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Lee.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you to the Asia Society for this opportunity to share with you my gleanings on the North Korean family with a focus on Kim Yo Jong. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen, everyone, for taking the time out of your very busy schedule to be here this evening. Would you like me to address some what I deem to be some salient issues, some arguments that I try to make in the book, or do you have questions?
Please do. Yeah, I'd like to know why you chose to write this book on Kim Yo Jong and what makes her to be so dangerous.
Well, you know, I've been sort of obsessed with this family regime over the last 20 years. As a young graduate student, I knew little about North Korea, which is kind of common among South Korean citizens. There is pervasive apathy, indifference even to things North Korean in South Korea, which is hard to explain, but that is unfortunately the case. And as I began to read up on the grotesque human rights violations going on inside North Korea, just a few miles from where my family in South Korea lives, as I understood, as I came to learn about these political prisoner concentration camps, I grew a bit embarrassed that I knew so little about these ongoing crimes against humanity. So that was the portal, human rights issues, for me to study about North Korea. And of course, the regime plays the key role in perpetuating this kind of misery, hunger, and oppression. Kim Yo Jong, to me, is especially interesting because she is the first preeminent, powerful leader of the family clan, of the royal house, to hold real power in public and to serve as the deputy, the dear supreme deputy to her brother. She has issued over 40 formal written statements since the onset of COVID, since early March 2020, under her name. It is very clear that she is running the show, her nation's policy toward the United States, South Korea, and much of the world. She says so herself. She says that by the authority vested in her by Comrade Chairman, her brother, by the party, the Workers' Party of Korea, and by the state, I shall henceforth pursue the following steps. And this was in June 2020, and she warned that this, quote, useless building, the North-South Joint Liaison Tower inside North Korean territory, built entirely and maintained entirely with South Korean funds, will soon be gone. She warned that, issued that warning in a written statement on June 13th, 2020, and 3 days later, demolished it was. Earlier in the month, in the same month, on June 4th, at about 6:15 a.m., Kim Yo Jong issued a written statement calling on South Korea to pass a new law criminalizing the sending of anti-DPRK, anti-North Korean regime leaflets and just about anything else that many North Korean emigres, former defectors turned activists do, sending into North Korea not only leaflets denouncing the regime, but also basic amenities like a pair of socks, a bar of soap, $1 bills, copies of the Bible, these toothpaste, toothbrush, things are in critical short supply in North Korea. The regime doesn't like that, of course, so she issued this order, almost, a decree calling on South Korea to criminalize such activities by passing a new criminal law. Amazingly, 4 hours later, the chief spokesman of the South Korean Ministry of Unification called for an unscheduled press conference and said, "We will work on it right away." And just 1 hour later, other government agencies chimed in, the Defense Ministry, the Foreign Ministry, the Blue House, the Presidential Office, arguing that sending leaflets brings all harm, no good, we will pass such a law, and it was passed. So that vignette, even just that she was able to extend southward across the border her nation's brutal, stifling censorship, speaks to her standing, her power, her influence. This is something that her grandfather, Kim Il-sung, the founder, could not achieve, or her father, Kim Jong-il, who died in 2011, or her brother, Kim Jong Un. But by virtue of her identity, a young woman, relatively young female deputy leader, she's able to get away with a lot more than, say, invective coming from her less photogenic, surly-looking brother, just because she's a young, pretty woman. She can get away with a lot. We are more prone to forgiving her potty-mouthed invective when she returns to a post-provocation peace phase, when North Korea calls for talks and smiling, they embrace, they shake hands with various world leaders. The next time we see that, she will be the face of her nation, leading her nation's diplomacy, and many of us, due to the pervasive tendency to patronize young women, pervasive in men, but I would also respectfully suggest some women too, we will probably underestimate her, forgive her for all her sins, rudeness, and want to believe her, and even want to believe that she's malleable, that we have some control over her, we can teach her, guide her. This is a fallacy, a dangerous one. So she is a major new weapon in her nation's diplomatic toolkit.
Thank you, Dr. Lee. I think, yes, Kim Yo Jong plays a very unique role. In your book, you describe her as being very attentive and taking over responsibilities very much as an aide to her brother and holding an ashtray for him at some points. But you also describe her as a mother-like figure, and I wonder what the significance of her being a woman plays and tells us about North Korean leadership, and is she being taken seriously?
Yeah, we've seen her bring with alacrity a Mont Blanc pen for her brother to sign various agreements, guest books, and so forth. And she was caught on film on a 70-hour-long train ride to Vietnam in February 2019 for the second summit meeting with President Trump. At nighttime, the two siblings were caught on camera. He was having a smoke. He's a chain smoker. And she was holding respectfully with both hands what looked to be a very expensive, fancy crystal ashtray. And many people saw that and said she's kind of servile to her brother. She's his secretary. There's that element too, but I see in the two siblings genuine affection, genuine trust. I've watched literally hundreds of hours of North Korean video documentaries, and they show scenes that you don't find in South Korean or other documentaries shown in other nations. The two seem to genuinely like each other. They often smile at each other during occasions of official events. They steal glimpses of each other and then kind of smile like this, as if to communicate that this day is going swimmingly, I think he really trusts her because she's capable, and of course because she's her brother. I don't see anyone within the royal family who, for now and for the next foreseeable future, let's say 15 years, is a viable candidate for the top leadership if Kim Jong Un were to become incapacitated today or next year or even 10 years from now. His children are very young, as we know, 10, 11, 12 or so, prepubescent. What can a 12-year-old son or daughter do until they reach maturity? Issue a written statement, give a public speech, receive a foreign delegation, lead her nation's delegation to South Korea or to Vietnam or China? I don't think so. So, although North Korea, we know, is a brutally male-dominated, chauvinistic society and culture, I would say that keeping power within the family and having one of their own, direct descendant of Kim Jong Un, Kim Jong Il, and so on, assume the throne, that supersedes any cultural, political biases. So for the next 10, maybe 15 years, I think she is the only viable candidate to emerge as the supreme leader, her gender notwithstanding.
You touched on Kim Jong Un's daughter, Kim Ju-ae, or Kim Jong Un, and I'd like to know, as we're starting to see her come out into the press and taking more photos together with her father, is this Kim Jong Un's way of showing a more human or fatherly figure, or is this symbolic of the future that he is trying to build for North Korea?
I think, Emma, this is a great leader mind trick, like Jedi mind trick. It's psychological manipulation of primarily the United States in projecting a softer family man image. I think Kim Jong Un is saying simultaneously, hello, our nukes are here to stay. My daughter, my children will inherit my nukes when the time comes. You, whether it's President Biden or President Yoon in Seoul or any leader of a democracy who come and go via elections, you'll not stay here 2 or 3 years from now. You'll be gone, whereas I'm here to stay and turn power down to my next generation. There's that message too, sort of boasting. But I think the more important message is, self-humanization, projecting the image of a loving father. What does that achieve? Well, by repetition, through repetition, one day, a president in the White House might come to say, well, it's really virtually impossible to roll back their nuclear weapons program. And obviously, he's a family man. He loves his daughter. Maybe he's not nuts. Maybe he's not bonkers after all. Maybe we can learn to live with North Korean nuclear weapons. I think that kind of adjustment to a new reality is what North Korea wants to achieve by projecting this happy image of father and daughter.
In the beginning of your book, you include the Mount Paektu family tree, which I think is a really great visual for understanding how the different branches interact with each other. And I noticed the inclusion of Kim Jong Un's children. However, there's no inclusion of children for Kim Yo Jong.
Is Kim Yo Jong married? Does she have a husband? Does she have children? We don't know. When she visited South Korea for the opening ceremony of the Winter Olympics in February 2018, the next day she visited the Blue House, the president's office, and mingled with various South Korean senior officials, of course, throughout her 2-night, 3-day stay. She reportedly told her South Korean counterparts that she's, yes, married and has children, and may even have said she's pregnant at that time, due to deliver her next child sometime in the next couple of months or so. And internet sleuths around the world observed at the time that she looks a bit heavier, not really visibly very starkly different, but maybe a bit of a bulge around her midsection. And when she showed up again at a big high-profile event, her brother's summit meeting with the South Korean president in the inter-Korean village Panmunjom on April 27, 2018, she looked visibly thinner. So People believe that at some point between early February and late April, she may have given birth to her second or third child. We don't know. But none of this can be confirmed. She turned 36 just a few days ago, so it's reasonable to assume that she does have children and is married.
If she were to become the supreme leader one day, what would happen then for her next leader? Would it be her children, or would it go back to Kim Jong Un's children?
Well, I think it's sort of human nature, but once you emerge as the supreme leader, it's very hard to relinquish that kind of absolute power. North Korea is an absolutist monarchy of the medieval age. You know, they pretend to be a democracy where there's gender equality and all those good things, but it is a brutal, absolute monarchy. And once you seize that kind of absolute power, I think it's virtually impossible to voluntarily give that away. Power struggle, fratricide we've seen in the North Korean family, killing the stepbrother, killing a nephew in 1997 who defected to South Korea upon the orders of Kim Jong-il. Kim Jong-il's nephew was killed. We've seen the uncle killed, Chang Song-taek, in late 2013. So fratricide, nepoticide, avunculicide, I looked up these words in the dictionary, killing of uncle and nephew and all those things. It's a staple of the North Korean way of life. So what happens in the future? Will there be a power struggle between the aunt and the niece or nephew? One cannot rule it out. At that point, I guess, the more interesting fictional speculative storyline becomes, who will strike first? Will the aunt, having held real power, about to be relegated to the role of a regent, an advisor, will she not remember, will she forget her own experience, including with a brother, to have the uncle killed? That wrathful, nipping winter of 2013, I think those memories will linger.
We've seen a rekindled relationship, I would say, between Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong Un this year. And Kim Jong Un recently traveled to Vladivostok, Russia for the Far Eastern Summit. I don't believe we saw Kim Yo Jong on this trip.
Actually, she was on the trip.
She was.
And she was seen wearing a very expensive Dior bag. I mean, they're very rich, so it's it's an interesting, thing to note, but they live like kings. The nation's poor, the people are starving, but the royal family is super filthy rich.
And quite large consumers of alcohol and luxury vehicles.
Yes.
Yes. I'd like to know, on this recent trip that Kim Jong Un took, how it differs from the one mentioned in your story.
So Kim met with Putin in the Russian Far East at a space rocket launch facility in mid-September, September 12th. It was the first time that Kim Jong Un traveled outside his country, his sister too, since the onset of COVID. And the last time he had traveled outside his country and held a summit meeting with a world leader was with Putin in April 2019. That trip did not go very well for Kim Jong Un because Kim Jong Un was told on the day of his meeting with Putin that Putin had places to go the next day, that he would be flying down to Beijing, China, for a very important international meeting, the Second Belt and Road Initiative conference. What's the problem there? Well, Kim had assumed that the next morning Putin would join him in a wreath-laying ceremony at a veteran cemetery. But moreover, it's a breach of diplomatic protocol. If you have a foreign head of state visiting you in your country, you try your best not to leave that person hanging, and by thus giving the signal that I have people to meet, places to go, you're just a tourist, have a nice time. Normally you try to avoid that unpleasant situation. But not only Putin did that, leave his country while Kim Jong Un was still in Russia, but revealed it to Kim at the very last minute. So how did Kim take this? He and Putin met for about 4 hours, from about 2 p.m. to 6 p.m. And, they had a banquet. Alcohol was consumed, of course. And once Putin bid farewell, it was still light out, it was still not dark. Kim went back to his facilities and proceeded to drink by himself 2 whole bottles of vodka. How do we know this? Well, confidential, but we have some technology. And showed up to his first meeting the next morning 2 hours and 40 minutes late. And then canceled everything, a visit to the zoo, ballet in the evening, and went home. So that was not a happy first summit meeting. Whereas now the situation, the world has changed with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Now Putin, it seems, needs Kim as much as Kim needs Putin.
It sounds like Putin took a page out of the Kim family playbook to, leave them be and off.
Well, Putin's notorious for showing up very late to important meetings, sometimes 2-3 hours late. But Putin was actually standing there in April 2019, waiting for Kim. And his sister was not on that trip. And it may be linked to the very unpleasant experience Kim Jong Un had when Donald Trump just left Kim there in Hanoi, Vietnam, in late February, and took off, got on his jet, Air Force One, and flew back to the United States, thus making Kim look like he had time on his hands. So that train ride back home from Vietnam to North Korea, 70 hours, was not very pleasant.
Oh, I'm sure.
In fact, Kim had everyone except his sister punished physically during the train ride. But for whatever reason, Kim Yo Jong did not attend the Kim-Putin summit on April 25th, 2019. And Kim looked disheveled. He was red in the face. He was breathing really hard, audibly. You could hear him in the documentaries, heaving like this, walking maybe about 50 yards or so. And as he got out of his Mercedes-Benz sedan, his signature black mouse suit, it was all ruffled, bent upward like this, his coattail, revealing the broad contours of his backside. And no one, of course, on that retinue could have dared to put their hand on the great leader, especially in the vicinity of his derriere, and straighten things out, except for his sister. But when he needed his sister, she was not there. But on this recent summit, Kim and Putin visibly looked happy, like they need each other. We're buddies now. So Kim needs from Putin high-tech military technology, satellite, rocket technology, and so on. And Putin needs from Kim conventional weapons, artillery, shells, which North Korea has in plentiful supply. So according to a report yesterday, I think, at CBS, North Korea has begun supplying Russia with artillery in a methodical way recently.
Back to Kim Yo Jong's leadership abilities, we've really seen that she's capable of stepping up and taking the role of bad cop. And in your book, you provide an example of when former President Bill Clinton traveled to North Korea for the release of journalists Laura Ling and Una Lee, and Kim Yo Jong being there not only to manage the delegation, but going right up to Doug Band to collect something. I won't say what, you'll have to read the book to find out. But I'm so interested in this situation that you lay out for us. Are there any other instances that you can tell the audience of where she plays bad cop?
Yes, so the term good cop, bad cop. In 2018, I suppose we can say she played that role, the role of the good cop, the happy, charming face of her brutish nation, by showing up in Pyeongchang and by meeting with various leaders next to her brother. And then, again, since the onset of COVID, there's been a clever role reversal. She's played the role of the even worse cop to the bad cop that is her brother. So, in that June 13th statement, when she adumbrated the blowing up of this tower built with South Korean funds, she also said, I will soon deploy our troops into the border region, thus coming across as threatening to take military action. She said she had the authority to move troops. That's quite a statement. And people were quite nervous at the time. And about 10 days later, Kim Jong Un convened a meeting and he announced to the world, we will suspend that plan to deploy troops, thus coming across as the saner, more restrained party to her wild sister, to his twisted sister. So it's a very clever role reversal because they will revert to their original roles. Kim Jong Un, the bad cop, Kim Yo Jong, the good cop, at some point. And again, she'll come out beaming smiles and call for talks, and it will be very difficult, I think, next to impossible, for any US administration or South Korean administration to turn their back on her and say, we are not interested in peace.
Leading into hostage diplomacy, last Friday we heard that U.S. Private Travis King was going to be released to U.S. officials. Private King had previously been detained by North Korean officials after darting across the DMZ earlier this summer. It seems like in the past, North Korea has shown much more willingness to engage with former and present U.S. leadership. Would you say that you were surprised that they didn't leverage this position more?
Thank you, and I'll try to link that to your question on Bill Clinton's visit to North Korea, which I neglected to do, pardon me. So Travis King, private second class, a low-ranked U.S. Army soldier who had been in trouble with the law. He served time in South Korea for vandalism and assault for violence. He was to be flown back to the United States in mid-July and face some further disciplinary action by the DOD. And as Emma said, he posed as a tourist on a visit to the border village on July 18th and bolted across the border into North Korea and was detained. He probably has been regretting that decision ever since, but was released a month later. He's back in the US now. Does North Korea do hostage diplomacy? Oh, yes. Oh, yes. And one such example was detaining two young female American journalists in March 2009 who worked for a TV studio that was in part owned by Al Gore, former vice president. The two women and two other colleagues, men, were filming along the border in the northeastern part of North Korea and doing a documentary on the plight of North Korean women who escape into China and suffer all kinds of hardship. And apparently they waded into North Korean territory. That's what North Korea claims. There's no delineated border. It's a river. And North Korean guards came chasing after them. They ran away into the Chinese side. The two men got away. They ran faster, but the women were detained. Lisa Ling was beaten with the butt of a rifle right in her head, and she fainted. She told me this in person. Anyway, so the two were sentenced to years of hard labor for anti-state activities. And Bill Clinton, his former aide in the White House and post-White House years also for about 10 years, Douglas Band, I spoke with him for about 3 hours about this episode. They borrowed a plane, a private jet from the Hollywood mogul Steve Bing, and flew into North Korea upon Kim Jong-il's request that Bill Clinton and no one else come, and then I will release the US detainees. At the time, I won't say what Kim Yo Jong was asking for, but she was there. At the time, she was about 21, about to turn 22, quite young. But on a hot summer day in early August 2019, when the plane touched down, she was there. She came straight to Douglas Band, completely ignoring the much more famous celebrity in former President Clinton, and said, "Give it to me now." Doug Band said, "We want to see the detainees first, make sure that they're in good health," and so on. And at the banquet, she was sort of managing the whole event. issuing orders, directing traffic, and so on, and was a participant in the dinner. She did not sit at the head table with her father, but the Americans knew who she was. They wanted to catch a glimpse of her brother, Kim Jong Un, but he was nowhere to be seen. The Americans were also interested in the health condition of Kim Jong-il because the previous summer, Kim Jong-il, the father, had suffered a massive stroke. And experts said probably he'll be gone within the next 5 years. And indeed, Kim Jong-il died in 2011. So this was a rescue mission, but the American delegation, of course, was interested in gaining some intelligence or information. But Band was struck by her attitude. All business, no hello, no niceties, just give it to me now. That's what she demanded.
I'm glad that you mentioned the South Korean law in 2020 that criminalized the sending of propaganda leaflets over the DMZ. It's my understanding that this has been taken back recently.
Well, the Constitution Court of South Korea found it unconstitutional.
Yes.
So it's not going to be repealed anytime soon, but not really enforced, I don't think.
Okay. So what kinds do you think we'll see a resumption of materials being sent back over to North Korea, and what kind of information do you think will be included?
Well, there are about 34,000 North Koreans who have resettled in South Korea. Not all, of course, but many are activists. Some are more outspoken and a bit more vigorous in their promotion, self-promotion. Some announce the time, date, location of the balloon launch, which gives North Korea, of course, information, a pretext to cause trouble. There has not been any casualties. There has not been a skirmish, the North and the South shooting at each other or at the activists. On October 10th, 2014, there was an incident. A human rights group in South Korea, led by a former North Korean, did launch balloons, had pre-announced it around 6 a.m. And then a few hours later, North Koreans, in a show of protest, they fired into the vicinity of the launch site. No one was there. The balloons were long gone, but they did fire rounds into that launch site in South Korea, which was concerning, of course. And then a couple of hours later, the South Koreans felt they had to protest as well. So they phoned North Korea, we're going to shoot some rounds, so don't be there, and then did sort of a protest. The previous South Korean government blew that episode up, again, worrisome, as if we came to the brink of war. Therefore, these balloons are very dangerous. They could cause damage to even human lives and property for people living near the border. Of course, no one would relish like people doing such activities in your own backyard, so that's understandable too. But my point is, all this had been blown up into something that was very, very dangerous to South Korean lives as well as North Koreans. Well, the human right, the right to receive, impart, share information is a universal human right. It's enshrined in Article 19 of the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And the drafters in the 1940s were very prescient. They said that to receive and to share information is a universal human right, regardless of the medium and regardless of borders. So transnational, country-to-country sending of leaflets is a basic right for the people of North Korea and for people sharing such information. Yet, just because Kim Yo Jong called for this gag law as coined by a senior British parliamentarian, Lord David Alton, just because Kim Yo Jong said pass a new law and send these people to jail, South Korea was compliant, which I thought was a very unfortunate development. And many UN agencies, watchdogs, NGOs all over the world harshly criticized South Korea's action at the time. But that's how it played. She issues an order, South Korea complies in the name of peace.
Your Comedy of Errors chapter, you expressed what I perceive to be a healthy amount of skepticism leading into each of the summits between Kim Jong Un.
You think so? Just a little bit? Just a tad?
Between Kim Jong Un and former President Trump, as well as Kim Jong Un and former South Korean President Moon Jae-in. But it also appears that some of the pundits maybe have a little bit of amnesia about previous summits and are keen
It will
to...
happen again. There will be collective amnesia the next time Kim Yo Jong or Kim Jong Un says, let's meet.
Yes, and so I wanted to know if you could explain further why you're so skeptical and why Singapore and Hanoi summits were a disaster.
It was all kind of preordained. You know, many people say North Korea is unpredictable. I think what they usually mean is eccentric or unconventional. If there's a streak of unpredictability, then there's an element of predictability in that unpredictable behavior. So by the time the first inter-Korean summit meeting that Kim Jong Un held with the then President Moon Jae-in of South Korea in April 2018, I'd seen this movie before. It was more like Rambo 4. And by Rambo 4, you have a pretty good idea how the movie is going to end. The first one was a very good movie, First Blood. Anyway, so I was very skeptical, of course, and critical because Kim Jong Un announced during his New Year's Day speech in 2018, that he's amenable to sending a delegation to the Winter Games in South Korea. And of course, did send his sister. And when Kim Jong Un called for talks with President Trump, a message that was brought physically by senior-most South Korean foreign policymakers to the White House on March 8th, after having been wined and dined by none other than Kim Jong Un in Pyongyang that Monday on March 5th. Trump said on the spot, let's do it, the sooner the better. And I knew that disaster was looming at the time. I was on a live BBC radio program interview during the Inter-Korean Summit on April 27th. The other guest was a very fine veteran reporter for a major US newspaper. And they were very cheerful and optimistic, feels different this time, I think it's for real, and so on. I didn't say anything, and the moderator said, what about you, Mr. Lee? Well, you know, I'm a bit skeptical. Why are you so cynical? And I replied, well, when you've been repeatedly mobbed by the duo tag team of reality and history, yeah, one grows a bit skeptical. When I say Rambo 4, I really mean it. We first saw this, the crazy-looking North Korean dictator coming out and coming across as not only not crazy, but completely charming and super intelligent and well-informed. It was in 1972, the original great leader, Kim Il-sung, reading the geopolitical shift in the sway of forces, international environment, with President Nixon's visit to China in February 1972, that rattled a lot of nations, both China's dependent client states like North Korea and North Vietnam, and America's dependent client states like Taiwan, South Korea, Japan. Are they going to abandon us? The fear of abandonment, you know, it's a stock phrase in my field, but it's real. So what did Kim Il-sung do? Act belligerent? No. In May 1972, for the very first time, Kim Il-sung received reporters from the New York Times, Harrison Salisbury and John Lee. Salisbury was a very famous former Moscow bureau chief, and John Lee was the bureau chief in Japan. The two were entertained by Kim Il-sung in his office for 3 hours on May 26, 1972. 1 month later, Selig Harrison, reporter for the Washington Post, was entertained by Kim Il-sung. And then in July, a Harvard law professor was received by Kim Il-sung. And all three delegations said Kim Il-sung is something like a visionary. He's a dictator, yes, but he's rational, he's well-informed. And Kim Il-sung told the New York Times reporters things that were very sweet, like, you know, we have to maintain our anti-US stance. You know, I have a constituent to please. The brutal Korean War, Americans killed a lot of people. So even if I don't mean it entirely, we have to say anti-US things. You know, the South Korean dictator, military man, I'm open to meeting with him without preconditions. And of course, American forces, US troops in South Korea, they'll have to go eventually, but That doesn't have to be a precondition for talks with the South Korean leader. It sounds very reasonable, and so on. Rambo 2 was in 2000 when Kim Jong-il, upon inheriting power upon the death of his father in 1994, for the next 6 years, never traveled outside his country, never received a foreign dignitary, and then he showed up in Beijing in May 2000. Why? Because he had an all-important, the first ever inter-Korean summit in June. The South Korean president, Kim Yo Jong, was to visit. And then in July, Kim Jong-il hosted a man called Vladimir Putin. That is the first and to date the only time a top Russian or Soviet leader ever visited North Korea. And Putin, I think, will repeat that and visit again soon. And then what did Kim Jong-il do? Stop there? No. He sent a special envoy to President Clinton in October 2000. And Vice Marshal Cho Myung-ro came with a big envelope carrying a nice, cordial invitation letter for President Clinton to visit. Clinton was very interested. And 12 days later, Secretary of State Madeleine Albright was in Pyongyang toasting Kim Jong-il. And she actually reported back to her boss, President Clinton, that, yeah, you should make the trip. And he was going to, except for the vote recount, Florida vote recount, following the election on November 7th between Al Gore and George W. Bush. And Gore did not concede defeat until mid-December, December 13th. So time simply ran out for Clinton to make that trip before stepping down in January the following year. But Kim Jong-il, what did he do? Undeterred, in January, he visited China and visited all the major special economic zone cities like Shanghai, Zhuhai, Shenzhen. He visited Huawei, tech company, repeating what Deng Xiaoping, the first Asian dictator turned reformer, had 9 years before in the early 1980s, leading his nation, China, on a path toward gradual opening and reform. And then he took the train to Moscow and met with Putin in August in 2001, received the Japanese Prime Minister in September 2002, and so on. So Kim Jong-un, Rambo 3, or Rambo 4, Howie. Kim Jong-un, what did he do? For the first 6 years, never met with a world leader, except for Dennis Rodman, former great basketball player. Never traveled outside his country, and then he popped up in Beijing in March 2018. Why? Because he had an important inter-Korean summit coming up the next month. And then, as we know, the rest is history. Met with Trump, met with Xi Jinping several times. He's made 4 visits to China. The last was on his birthday in January 2019. So there's another China visit coming, I would say. And Xi visited Kim Jong-un in June 2019. So there's a strategy to all this. North Korea doesn't go berserk and asks for war, a nuclear war. They go through this ladder of graduated escalation, and then they know when to dial it down, back it down, and just come down the ladder and revert to a very charming, exciting post-provocation peace ploy. And they'll do it again, I don't know when, maybe next year, maybe 2 years from now, but I see Kim Yo Jong playing a central role in the next post-provocation peace phase.
Dr. Lee, you've been an advocate for tougher sanctions on North Korea. I'd like to know how the United States or organizations like the UN could take a tougher stance against North Korea's military provocations, as well as their illicit cyber activities.
Well, sanctions enforcement, like domestic law enforcement, is very hard work, laborious, labor-intensive. You have to do the investigation, surveillance, build up your case, take it to the courts, and then you have to monitor and enforce the law. Like domestic law enforcement, even the toughest criminal laws on the books, if the police or the FBI or the law enforcement folks are not enforcing the law, it's kind of meaningless. And that kind of law enforcement needs to be maintained, of course. You can't just do it for a year and then let go. We've never had sustained, tough, meaningful sanctions enforcement against North Korea, ever. In 2017, it did get tough but it lasted for about a year. And then with the charm offensive by the Kims in 2018, it just fell apart. Most nations of the world, most UN member states don't have a dog in this fight. They don't care. And of course, with Putin's invasion of Ukraine, we can't even pass a condemnation, a tough-worded resolution at the UN Security Council because Russia and China have been actively blocking any such attempt to denounce North Korea, although North Korea has fired way more than 100 ballistic missiles since January 2022 and numerous intercontinental ballistic missiles. Nothing's ever done. So I think, dwelling on the mistakes of the past is kind of miserable and probably not all that helpful. But just to give you one example, during the Obama administration, there was really tough sanctions enforcement against Iran for violating U.S. laws, sanctions laws on Iran and Iraq and Sudan and some other countries. The Obama administration vigorously enforced sanctions and imposed fines in the hundreds of millions of dollars on major international banks, mostly in allied nations. A whopping 8.9 billion on the fourth largest bank in the world, the biggest in France, BNP Paribas. They pay. Why? Because otherwise you'll be blocked out of the US dollar system. That's a death knell for a major corporation or bank. Over 600 million on Standard Chartered, over 600 million fine on ING, 1.9 billion on Commerzbank. Deutsche Bank was fined 1.4 billion. Tokyo Mitsubishi, Bank of Tokyo Mitsubishi, 315 million. Anyway, so all these banks, friendly nations mostly, they pay, they comply. With respect to North Korea sanctions violations, it's mostly the Chinese banks, which are some of the biggest in the world, Agriculture Bank, Construction Bank, Bank of China, and so on. There has never been any attempt by any administration to penalize, to levy such fines, with knowledge of China's serial violation of UN laws and UN Security Council resolutions. Is it too late to try to do that? I don't know. I'm growing pessimistic. Again, if there is ever an attempt to seriously enforce sanctions against North Korea by penalizing North Korea's partners, then the point is such efforts need to be maintained over time. But again, leaders in democracies face term limit. They want an agreement, carve out a legacy, have a flashy summit, more than doing the hard work over time. It's a strategic disadvantage for the United States and a strategic advantage for the North Korean dictator in perpetuity.
Next year, the United States will be having a presidential election. What are you most concerned about for that outcome, and what are you most hopeful for?
Let me sort of try to be a bit devious and deflect that question and imagine myself Kim Jong Un or Kim Yo Jong in Pyongyang. Who do I want to be elected? I think Donald Trump. Because, well, the two men used to write love letters, as President Trump himself said. They met several times, in Singapore, in Vietnam, at the border village on June 30th, 2019, for a photo op as well at Panmunjom. They had some kind of a rapport. And as I feared, upon the first meeting in Singapore on June 12th, President Trump, who had delivered the previous year in 2017 on a visit to South Korea, addressing the South Korean Parliament National Assembly on November 7, 2017, Trump gave the most brilliant speech on North Korea's human rights violation. It was inspired. How long did that interest in North Korea's grave crimes against humanity last? It went out the window. During his press conference on June 12th, after his meeting with Kim, a reporter for the Washington Post asked about human rights in North Korea, and President Trump defended North Korea, said, well, it's rough over there, but it's rough in a lot of other places. You know, he's a tough leader. He's doing his thing. He's got to take a tough stance. So I see that kind of dynamic, the possibility of that kind of dynamic, and the Kim siblings probably manipulating President Trump's propensity toward vanity, again, thinking that he can patronize them or control them by virtue of his own great talent and intelligence and charisma. I think that's a dangerous assumption, this notion that the Kims are malleable, easily controlled, just because you're so great.
I'd like to open it up for Q&A now. We'll have some mics coming by. If you could please state your name and affiliation if you would like. Thank you. Over here in the front.
My name is James Harbison. I'm a member here at the Asia Society. I finished your book this morning, and I found out you were speaking, so I ran over, came from upstate to hear you speak. I was confused by some aspects of your book. As a Westerner, I'm not sure how stratification in society works in certain Asian cultures. And I was thinking about the Romania, and North Korea seems like the most monarchy, like a monarchy in some ways, even though it's a communist regime, the way Romania at one time seemed like it had a communist regime with aspects of a monarchy in it. And I thought that was really interesting. I wanted to know, I wanted to know if you studied the history of Korea, the whole peninsula, and recognized tendencies or mindsets of yesteryear that are incorporated into the mindset of the Kim family, especially in terms of racial purity. I don't know if the subject of your book is just using racism as a juvenile sort of like a troll would be, or if there's true sort of an ideology of racial superiority within her, either Korean society or within her society, her part of Korean society. And I was wondering if you could help us explain. It seems confusing for us in the West because communism, at least on the surface, is supposed to make people more equal. So it seems very strange that a communist regime that's militantly communist in some ways is also sort of so obviously unequal. I was wondering if you could help us get us started in understanding class stratification in North Korea right now.
Thank you. Well, Walt Whitman famously said, "Do I contradict myself? Very well, then I contradict myself. I contain multitudes." North Korea is a multiple contradictory society. They pretend to be, as you said, an egalitarian communist system, but it is the most unequal, the most repressive, the most extreme cult of personality, arguably in world history. Historians on both the left and right of the ideological spectrum have long agreed that North Korea is the most perfected, most advanced totalitarian system the world has ever seen. Stalin, Mao, they're like kindergarten level. No Korean absolute monarch of the past, of course, had access to the kind of technology, surveillance, eavesdropping that North Korea has had and practiced over the past 7 decades. To give you an example, in North Korea, and we have a distinguished public intellectual and former North Korean senior official here, Sung-Yoon Lee, I think you can attest to it. You need a travel permit to go from your town to the next town over. They used to have random late night searches, like security folks show up in the middle of the night just to make sure you don't have an unauthorized visitor. A monumental UN study, the UN Commission of Inquiry report on human rights in North Korea, published in February 2014, makes a very serious allegation that the nature, the gravity, and the scale of North Korea's crimes against humanity reveal a state that has no parallel in the contemporary world. That's verbatim. no parallel in the contemporary world, that North Korea is guilty of, quote, knowingly causing prolonged starvation, end quote. These are serious allegations, a policy of deliberate mass starvation, end quote, and backs it up with evidence, data, and so on. So yeah, is North Korea contradictory, full of contradictions? Yes. And one could, of course, argue that all political systems in varying degrees are too in democracies, but we're talking about a different level of contradiction here. And North Korea is so unique, it's so different. I often say North Korea is uniquely unique, although my grade school grammar teacher in London would wince at that violation of an absolute adjective. Anyway, so you can't be more unique or less unique if you're really unique, but it's uniquely unique. I mean, you know, North Korea is a population of maybe 25, 26 million, not tiny, but relatively small country, yet maintains a standing army of close to 1.2 million.
Half the population of South Korea,
Yes,
roughly.
yes. But South Korea has a big army too, by the way.
Yes.
But in terms of, you know, the number of able-bodied men between the ages of 16 and 50 serving in the North Korean army at any given time, it's about 1/5 of the male population. Nowhere on earth do you see that. Only China and the US, maybe Russia, have slightly bigger standing armies than North Korea. And we're talking about, you know, hundreds of millions, billions of people, India too. In terms of its defense budget, North Korea, anywhere between 25 to 30% is on defense. Hyperinflated spending. So North Korea is very different, and North Korea is arguably the most egregious violator of human rights, as this UN study argues. But to me, the uniquest, the most unique aspect of North Korea, and the most disturbing, startling aspect of North Korea, I dwell a bit on this book in a later chapter, is the following. North Korea is the first and only case in world history of an industrialized, urbanized, literate country undergoing a famine. And I believe it shall remember forever the only industrialized, literate country to have suffered a famine. A major famine struck North Korea from about 1994 to 1998. How many people died? We don't know. There are, you know, estimates of about 500,000 to maybe as high as over 3 million. We can say with confidence many people starved to death during those years. What's the problem? Well, you have starvation, famine-like conditions in many other immiserated countries in many other parts of the world. Well, none of them, no other country in any major UN food insecurity study is a fully industrialized, urbanized, literate society. Literate, by literacy, we mean somebody above the age of 16, 18, who knows basic sentences, who can read and write basic sentences like my name is so-and-so. We're not talking about high school level or graduate school level kind of literacy. Well, in some very poor countries, agriculture-based countries in other parts of the world, there are, especially among the female population, alarming rate of illiteracy. People who can't even write their own name, can't even count from 1 to 10. People who are illiterate and innumerate, sometimes as high as 80% of the female population. Just think of the astounding difficulties, economic disadvantage in such an underprivileged society. North Korea is the opposite. It achieved industrialization even before South Korea did. It was richer than South Korea until about the early 1970s, and then somehow took a great leap backward. But the problem here is, yes, there was bad weather. There was poor soil management. Yes, the Soviet subsidies came to a halt with the collapse of the Soviet Union, all exacerbating factors. But what did Kim Jong Un do after his father died in July 1994? He spent about $800 million with which to renovate this palace make it into the most lavish, extravagant mausoleum in the world. He spent $1.5 billion on his missile programs alone during those years. He spent another $1.3 billion or so purchasing about 40 outdated Soviet MiGs from Ukraine and Kazakhstan and so on. He had money with which to import food. How much are we talking about? Maybe $200 million worth of grain. If he had done that, spent $200 million with which to buy food and distribute that equitably, no one would have died. Chose not to. And since then, it's been almost 40 years now, since the famine. Same conditions, similar, comparable conditions have returned since COVID. There are reports of piles of dead bodies from starvation piling up in various parts throughout North Korea, including richer big cities like Kaesong just across the border. And over the past 30 years, again, North Korea, in this study by the UN, annual study, the prevalence of undernourishment among the population, North Korea is sometimes number 3 in the world. It's always in the top 5, together with Haiti, Central African Republic, Zambia, and so on. Again, illiterate, immiserated economies, often beset by internal unrest. North Korea, de facto peacetime, industrialized, literate society. So the ongoing hunger, and North Korea says, and some North Korea defenders who are uninformed or ideologically committed to defending North Korea, they say things like, well, the famine and hunger today over the past 30 years is due to US sanctions and climate change. Well, US sanctions, there were no US sanctions other than no imports of North Korean goods until 2016. Not a single US North Korea sanctions legislation until February 2016. There were no UN sanctions whatsoever against North Korea until North Korea's first nuclear test in October 2006. The famine started 10 years before that, in the mid-90s. And some people also say US sanctions and climate change, that's why the North Koreans are hungry. It's a marvel of nature and logic to me that climate change each year, without fail, stops right at the border with China and South Korea. That it affects only North Korea. No one's starving to death, hardly, in either South Korea or China. In fact, they're doing pretty well. So this is, as the UN study alleges, a man-made, man-sustained hunger that is passed down from generation to the next generation through this insidious political classification system. Every North Korean newborn is thrust into a political class. You inherit your parents' either its favorable top class or the lowest class. Your identity, your life ahead is charted out for you at birth through this hereditary political, discriminatory political classification system. So yes, North Korea is full of contradictions, and it is a brutal regime.
I'd like to open it up for any other questions there may be. In the back there.
Thanks very much for this very insightful talk. My question is, what do you see as North Korea's end game, if you will, 20 years from now, 50 years from now? Is this the state that they choose to continue to be, or is there something different that you think might emerge over several decades into the future?
Thank you. We're being recorded, right? Yes. So I shouldn't be too flippant, but once upon a time when I was a college student, my roommate, Victor, suggested, hey, let's go to a buffet, eat to excess, I think pig out was the verb he used, and then go bar hopping. And as somebody not entirely opposed to that kind of sybaritic lifestyle, I nonetheless cynically turned to my friend and said, hey, Victor, is that really necessary? And then my friend grew indignant and turned to me and said, are you really necessary? Ever since I've been grappling with that existential question, am I really necessary? I don't know, probably not. If you were to impiously pose that very same question to Kim Jong Un and to the nation he rules over, the DPRK. Why do you have to exist when there is a very, very attractive, successful, wealthy, free Korean state across the border? We know that Korea remained under a single polity, undivided, for over 1,000 years, until 1945, when the two principal victors in history's greatest war, the US and the Soviet Union, divided Korea. It was to be a temporary division to facilitate the surrender of Japanese troops dispersed throughout the peninsula, but here we are still, decades later. Would Kim Jong Un be content to be relegated forever to be the great leader of the loser Korean state? I've not had a chance to ask him that, but I fear perhaps not. Why? Because they say things like, well, we will finish the Juche, the self-reliant revolution, by incorporating the entire Korean peninsula. They say things in the Constitution like, the quote, the supreme national task of the party and the state is the completion of the unification program. Do they refer to being absorbed by South Korea? I doubt it very much. So do they have malign intentions for the South, one day incorporating all of South Korean territory and people? I think so. Where's the evidence? Well, again, they say such things all the time, but they lie all the time too, yes. The first, and to date, the only big gamble was the Korean War that the grandfather started. And Kim Il-sung persuaded Stalin and Mao to give him the green light, the go-ahead, because all signs coming out of Washington in those days were that the US doesn't care. Basically, the US had come to abandon South Korea despite having governed South Korea for 3 years, 45 to 48. Responsible people like Secretary of State Dean Acheson, General MacArthur, and so on, said so publicly. You know, c'est la vie. Communist invasion could happen in any place. Why obsess over Korea? It's a backward country. Was back then. Well, when events took over with the news of the North Korean invasion, the Truman administration saw that invasion as a test of the US resolve. Korea was not an intrinsically worthwhile, valuable asset to the United States in those days, but to take no action and let this happen would probably, Americans thought, encourage Stalin and Mao, who must be controlling this puppet called Kim Il-sung in his 30s at the time. It would only stimulate the other side to test American interests more aggressively in Europe. So the US made up its mind to take action to defend South Korea. That failed attempt, I think, that failed business of the supreme national task of uniting Korea under the DPRK auspices, I don't think North Korea has given up on that. And I think this dedication to developing North Korea's nuclear and ICBM technology is an essential component in this game. That is to become, as North Vietnam did by the early 1970s, a threat, a political burden to the United States by becoming a constant, serious, credible nuclear threat to the US mainland with their ICBM, nuclear-tipped ICBM technology, and then to sue for peace after small-scale provocations, lethal provocations, and as Vietnam achieved, in fact, through signing a peace treaty with the United States, by having all US troops withdraw from Vietnam, and then Congress blocked all these promises of aid to the South, and then roll in, as the North did in 1975, and achieve unification. It sounds to many people outlandish because you look at South Korea today, all the wealth, all these achievements in cultural terms as well as economic, political realms. North Korea really such a backward country, has such ambitions? It seems absurd, unbelievable. I think to North Korea, it's not only a believable and a compelling mission, it's a non-negotiable proposition to forever remain the inferior, poorer Korean state while South Korea serves as a magnet to your own people, this is an existential threat, ending up like East Germany perhaps one day. So yes, I think they have a grand strategy, as jarring as that term as applied to North Korea may sound.
All right, well, any other questions at this time? In the back there.
Hi, thank you so much for this talk. It's fascinating to hear your insights. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to your experience as an expert witness in the Otto Warmbier trial.
Yes, Otto Warmbier, University of Virginia top student, traveled to North Korea in late December with a travel group, and then he was detained as the group was to depart from the Pyongyang airport. And North Korea charged Warmbier of the serious crime of entering the DPRK under the auspices of the CIA with the purpose of undermining the single-handed unity of the DPRK. That was the official charge North Korea made through the Korean Central News Agency later that month in January 2016. Warmbier, a lot of people think, stole something, a poster. No, even North Korea does not make that claim. He was controlled by the CIA. He came into North Korea to do some major damage. That's what North Korea claims. And Warmbier was showcased in a coerced confession of his wrongdoings in front of the cameras on Leap Day, February 29th, and he was visibly afraid. And I read a lot of forced statements using North Korean verbiage, unidiomatic North Korean English, also using North Korean verbiage like DPR Korea in English, DPRK, Democratic People's Republic of Korea, the formal name of North Korea, but writing out DPR Korea, which is not natural to our ears. I also saw Warmbier make a valiant effort to signal to his family, his parents, that this is all a show, coerced. He kept saying that his father has lost his business, the family is in dire straits economically. He mentioned the name of his father's company incorrectly and said that his local church had promised him to give him $200,000 for his younger siblings' college tuition that he was responsible for as the eldest child, and that he would also be given a used car by this church that was controlled by the CIA. Just made no sense because Mr. and Mrs. Warmbier are very secure economically. The father's business is very successful. Otto was we learned later that he's a Jew, did not attend a church. So it was, really sinister ploy. And North Korea did not allow the Swedish embassy that has served as the liaison for the United States government in cases of US detainees in North Korea, did not even allow anyone to talk to Otto. Later, the next year, in June, to President Trump's credit, Kim Jong Un released Otto Warmbier, and he came home brain dead. Not in peaceful vegetative coma, but in writhing pain. He was deaf, blind, and mute, in visible, audible pain. And then he died days later. Did North Korea intend to kill him by torturing him? And there's evidence of torture. There's a 4-inch scar on his left ankle that was not there before he went to North Korea. And one assumes that North Korea planted an electrode to administer electric shock, which is a common North Korea torture tactic. The fact that he was brain dead strongly indicates, according to neurologists, that there was a cessation of blood flow to his brain for maybe over 15 minutes. So there is, more than reasonable, beyond a reasonable doubt, evidence of torture. Is there such a high degree of certainty with respect to intent to kill? No, but that's not necessary in this civil lawsuit that the Warmbier family bravely brought to the DPRK. And at the trial in a federal court, the U.S. District Court of Columbia, D.C., in December 2018, the judge explained, Beryl Howell, Chief Justice Howell explained that, yes, there is probable cause, and that's the standard. You know, it's more likely than not that North Korea kidnapped, tortured, and killed, extrajudicial killing, unlawful killing of Otto Warmbier, and awarded the family $501 million based on precedents, based on other cases of hostage taking and torture of American citizens as a deterrent. Increased the price quite a bit, actually, as a deterrent to North Korea, so that North Korea thinks twice about doing such things to US citizens again. It was my honor to participate, to write a written testimony, declaration, and to appear as an expert witness, take the stand. And I laid out that I believe that North Korea intentionally took a US person as hostage in early 2016 because that would afford North Korea an extra layer of security, a security blanket, as North Korea was gearing up for some major provocations that year throughout 2016. For example, on January 4th, North Korea conducted the nation's fourth nuclear test, the first in some 3 years. North Korea conducted the nation's first submarine launched ballistic missile test in April and August. It shot a long-range missile, ICBM technology, for the first time in 3 years on February 7th, and so on. And it certainly knew that a new sanctions law was coming, a meaningful, toughly worded sanctions legislation. This was in the news. So I think having a US hostage might temper any American will to really put pressure on North Korea economically, financially, politically, or even with military drills and so on. And I cannot prove that beyond a reasonable doubt, but that is my hunch based on over 20 years of studying North Korean history. And the Chief Justice agreed that that was a reasonable line of thinking. And based on other evidence, testimonies by other experts, doctors, dentists, Otto Warmbier's lower two teeth, middlemost teeth, had been pulled out and then planted back about half-inch inside his mouth, toward the back of his mouth, in the wrong place. And pulling out tooth extraction is another common torture technique in North Korea. So again, it's not necessary for the lawsuit to prove that North Korea intended to kill Otto. What they did already is bad enough. Take him as hostage, torture him, and ended up killing him. So yeah, it's a landmark legal case.
Dr. Lee, before we conclude, is there anything else you'd like to share with the audience about Kim Yo Jong or this book?
So the next time Kim Yo Jong smiles and says, let's talk, let us try not to all fall together into collective amnesia and embrace euphoria and peace, promises of peace, but take them seriously. She's not to be underestimated. Just because she's a pretty face, a young lady, a powerful person, that makes all that makes her an interesting figure. But she does not have pure, peaceful designs. The nature of her dynasty that perhaps she hopes to inherit one day, the nature of the regime, the cult of personality that needs to be maintained, the high privilege, extravagant lifestyle, power to have people executed on a whim, to play God, deciding who lives, who dies, just because they looked at me in a way I don't like them. These were traditionally the prerogatives of male supreme leaders. But according to reports from different locations in North Korea as of May 2021, she's been issuing such execution orders too. So she's not a nice lady. She's a fascinating political figure. And she has, I forgot to mention, issued several statements saying that basically her finger's on the nuclear button. In a statement on April 3rd and April 5th last year, she said that if South Korea shoots even a single bullet into North Korean territory, then I will unleash our state's nuclear force, that's what she said, nuclear force, and bring about something akin to total ruin and destruction. Very specific. And she said she has the authority. Her brother has given her the authority to do that. So that's why I say that she is a most dangerous woman, arguably the most dangerous woman in the world. We've never seen a despotess for life armed with nuclear weapons issuing threats of preemptive nuclear attack against a peaceful neighbor in South Korea. So she is to be watched and to be taken very seriously.
Wow. Well, please join me in thanking Dr. Lee this evening.
Thank you very much.